Winnipeg has always been shaped by the Red River. The city exists where it does because of the river, but the river has also been a source of danger for as long as people have lived here. Flooding is part of Winnipeg's history, but one flood stands out above the rest. In 1950, the river rose so high and so fast that it forced 1/3 of the city's population to flee. Entire neighborhoods disappeared, streets were washed away, and the downtown core came within inches of being lost. It was one of the darkest moments in Winnipeg's history, and yet, for decades afterward, people rarely spoke of it. It was so disturbing, so painful, that the city almost erased it from memory. The winter of 1949 to 1950 had been long and snowy, and when spring arrived, it came quickly. Heavy rains in April and a rapid snowmelt combined to swell the Red River far beyond normal levels. At first, people weren't overly alarmed. Winnipeg had flooded before, and while it was always a challenge, residents thought they knew what to expect. Sandbags were filled, dikes were raised, and life carried on. But as April turned into May, the water kept climbing. Each day the river rose higher, and soon it was clear that this flood wasn't like the others. By the first week of May, the river was at its highest level in modern history. Low-lying neighborhoods like St. V, St. Boniface, and parts of the North End were among the first to be swallowed. Families packed what they could into carts, trucks, and even rowboats, leaving behind houses they knew might not survive. The evacuation spread block by block until it became clear the entire city was at risk. What happened next was unprecedented. Over 100,000 Winnipeggers, nearly 1 in 3 people in the city, were forced to leave their homes. It was the largest peacetime evacuation in Canadian history. Streets were clogged with families carrying suitcases, pets, and whatever valuables they could manage. Schools, churches, and arenas were converted into makeshift shelters. Some families went to stay with relatives in rural Manitoba. Others were housed in army barracks or temporary camps set up on higher ground. The army was called in to help, and soon Winnipeg looked like a city at war. Soldiers filled sandbags around the clock, patrolled flooded neighborhoods in boats, and helped move residents to safety. Trains and trucks carried people out of the city in waves. For those who stayed behind, the sight of their city underwater was almost surreal. Streetcars and buses were replaced by boats navigating what used to be intersections. Downtown Winnipeg teetered on the edge of disaster, saved only by frantic last-minute efforts to raise dikes and hold back the river. At the flood's peak, more than 10,000 homes were destroyed and another 5,000 badly damaged. Businesses, factories, and schools were swamped. In some areas, the water was so deep that only rooftops and chimneys stuck out. People described the silence as eerie. A city of 500,000 people suddenly reduced to a hushed, half-empty shell. The mud and sewage that coated everything left a stench that hung in the air for months. For the families who lost their homes, the trauma was immense. Insurance didn't cover most flood damage, and government aid was limited. Many were left to rebuild on their own, often starting from nothing. For working-class families, especially in the North End, this meant years of hardship. Furniture, clothing, photographs, and heirlooms were all swept away. Some families never returned, forced to move elsewhere because their neighborhoods were too badly damaged to rebuild. The flood was also a political disaster. Both the provincial and federal governments were criticized for being slow to respond. Winnipeg had experienced major floods before, yet no permanent solution had ever been put in place. Critics accused leaders of ignoring repeated warnings from engineers who had said for years that a massive flood could one day overwhelm the city. By the time action was taken, it was already too late. Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent and Premier Douglas Campbell both visited Winnipeg during the flood, but their appearances did little to calm public anger. People wanted answers. Why had the city been left so vulnerable? And why had governments failed to act sooner? When the water finally receded in late May, the scale of destruction was almost beyond belief. Streets were covered in thick mud. Entire blocks were unrecognizable. It took months of cleanup before many neighborhoods were even livable again. Damage estimates ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars, an astronomical figure for the time. But what many found most disturbing wasn't just the physical damage. It was the emotional toll, the stress of evacuation, The fear of losing everything and the frustration of waiting for compensation left deep scars. For years afterward, many families avoided talking about the flood. It was too painful, too raw. In a city known for its resilience, the 1950 flood became a kind of collective wound that people tried to cover up by moving on quickly. And so, instead of being memorialized, it was quietly pushed aside. Unlike other disasters that become central to a city's identity, the 1950 flood was barely mentioned in schools or public ceremonies. It was as if Winnipeg wanted to forget it had ever happened. Out of that silence, though, came action. In the 1960s, Premier Duff Roblin championed the construction of the Red River Floodway, a massive channel built to divert floodwaters around the city. At the time, it was ridiculed and called Duff's Ditch. Critics said it was too expensive and unnecessary, but Roblin insisted, pointing to the devastation of 1950 as proof that Winnipeg could never risk such a disaster again. By the time the floodway was completed in 1968, it had cost more than $60 million, a huge investment, but it proved its worth almost immediately. Since then, the floodway has saved Winnipeg dozens of times, protecting the city from floods that could have rivaled or even surpassed 1950. In hindsight, it became one of the most important infrastructure projects in Canadian history. Ironically, the success of the floodway contributed to the erasure of the flood itself. Politicians preferred to celebrate the triumph of Duff's Ditch rather than dwell on the failures of 1950. Winnipeg became known as the city that beat the river, not the city that had once nearly been drowned by it. Today, when people talk about Manitoba floods, they often point to 1997, the flood of the century. But for Winnipeg itself, 1950 was far worse. The difference is that the 1997 flood hit rural Manitoba hardest, while the floodway kept the city safe. In 1950, there was no such protection, and Winnipeg bore the full force of the Red River's wrath. So why was the 1950 flood erased from history? Because it was a story of failure as much as survival. It was easier to focus on the success of the floodway than on the suffering that made it necessary. And because for the people who lived through it, forgetting was a way to cope with the trauma, but remembering it matters. The 1950 flood reshaped Winnipeg, physically and emotionally. It forced the city to rethink its relationship with the river. It created the political will for one of the country's greatest engineering projects, and it revealed just how vulnerable a city can be when nature decides to remind us who's in charge. For the families who lived through it, the memories never fully faded, even if the city chose not to speak about them. The water eventually went away, but the scars, both visible and invisible, remained.